Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Brooke McIntyre, and I'm here with Dr. Jeff Myers today. We're so excited to have you join us. We actually had such an overwhelming response to this event that I was told it crashed our system at one point. So I know many of you are actually joining via live stream, which is just fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us. We're really hoping that this next hour will provide you with the clarity and the confidence that you need to respond well and to think well through this really difficult cultural climate that we find ourselves in right now. So this is actually my first time on the Summit virtual platform, but I know, Dr. Jeff, you've been on here many times
Yeah,
before.
well, welcome to the Summit virtual platform. It is a lot of fun. Those of you who managed to sign up early, you'll see that you're on a special platform. It's unique to Summit Ministries. It's called Summit Virtual. This is the platform we use for our 5-day-long student conferences that we're doing online right now. Now, they will have other things they can do that you won't be able to do just because of the size of the group. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people on this right now. But they have a mentor chat, for example, where 24 hours a day they can talk to someone if they feel anxious or just need to discuss something. They also have a chat where they can talk to one another during break times. They also have the Q&A function, which you will be able to use. So if you have questions you'd like to address, please do put those in there. They also have sort of a pulse function where they could just put their emotional reactions in there. Super important for Gen Z.
Sure.
We turned that off for y'all. Sorry, if you feel bad about that, you can chat to us a little bit later. But this is a really critical topic and a really critical time. This is Juneteenth today, and this is a celebration of a day when Abraham Lincoln officially proclaimed that slavery in the southern states would come to an end. And we still have things we deal with in our culture that relate all the way back to that sin of slavery that took place in our country. And I wanted to give a little bit of a historical perspective. In 1955, there was a teenage boy from Chicago, from Illinois. His name was Emmett Till. He was in Mississippi visiting relatives. He was accused of disrespecting a white woman in a grocery store. He was abducted, brutally beaten, shot in the head by the woman's husband and brother. They later admitted that they had done this. After Emmett Till's body was recovered from the Tallahatchie River, his mother insisted on a public funeral. And when photographs of his grotesquely mutilated body were circulated, and the all-white jury acquitted the murderers. It forced America to confront the violent evil of racism. And in many ways, Brooke, we are finding ourselves in another Emmett Till moment. Yeah. Except this moment, it's on video. 8 minutes, 46 seconds long, of a police officer, of George Floyd dying an agonizing death of suffocation with a police officer's knee. And we don't know yet whether that officer acted out of racial hatred. That would have to be established in court. But this killing it fits a deeply disturbing pattern. You had Ahmaud Arbery, who was killed by a former police officer in Brunswick, Georgia, the killing of Breonna Taylor. There was a no-knock warrant. The police rushed in. Her boyfriend tried to defend them. She ended up being shot 8 times. George Floyd's death was a tipping point. Demonstrators spilled into the streets. It spiraled into violence, rioters, looters, piling injustice upon injustice, even attacks on police officers now, including a retired African-American St. Louis police officer you may have heard about named David Dorn. So initially, there was a lot of outrage that came across all barriers, all political barriers, racial barriers, and so forth, but the division seems to be growing every single day. And the rhetoric is becoming more extreme by the minute. And people are no longer friends because of the things they've said to one another on social media. And the question for us today is, how should Christians respond to this? And Micah 6:8 says, "He's told you, O man, what is good. What does the Lord require of you? But to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God." The question is, what does this look like for the church, for the justice system, our communities? And we've got an hour to begin the discussion.
We'll handle it all in an hour.
In 1 hour. But before we dive in too much, we want you to interact with us. We'll have some polls going throughout the time we have together, and then we can see who is on and what you're thinking about different issues. So here's the poll question for you right now. This will be showing up on your screen. If you're in the Summit virtual platform, if you're on the live stream, I'm sorry, your opinion does matter to us. It just doesn't count today. So over the last month, what has influenced most of your ideas about race and justice? Okay, well, over the last month, what has influenced most of your ideas about race and justice? Social media, movies, music, church, family, friends. Those are the 5 options. So go ahead and vote. And as those votes come in, usually takes a few seconds, we will begin to discuss what we're seeing of those results.
This is such a good question. I know that I learned so much about this topic just in the last few months. And honestly, for me, it's mostly been through social media. It just seems like there's so many opinions, so many articles coming in that I've had to just process this onslaught. It's really important to be aware of where that information is coming from. And you want to have accurate information. You want to have complete information. So I think it's just really important to pay attention to where that is coming from.
Yeah, it's interesting to see the results. I think a lot of people, as I'm looking at this poll, are saying social media,
Here too.
and not very many through movies and music, although those are very persuasive.
Yes.
It doesn't seem to have influenced our audience that much. 35% say church, family, friends. Those are, so, and obviously there's a lot of conversation taking place here.
Yes.
But social media is still the dominant thing.
Yes.
I'm glad to see church is having an influence on people, to tell you the truth. When we have our students here for Summit Virtual, this is like 1%. Like they just do not believe the church has anything relevant to say about the big issues of our day.
All right, well, thank you everyone for doing this. This is really helpful for us to know where you're coming from. We're really excited. We're about to be joined by Dr. David Anderson. Dr. Anderson has a doctorate from the Oxford Graduate School's American Center for Religion and Society Studies, and he is the founder and senior pastor of Bridgeway Community Church, which is a large multi-site church in Maryland. Dr. Anderson is the author of 4 books on race and diversity, and he's the host of a daily radio talk show called Real Talk with Dr. David Anderson that airs in the Washington, D.C. area. So we're so excited to have him here today. I think he's gonna, yes, hello, Dr. Anderson.
Hey, Dr. Anderson.
Thanks for joining us.
I also want to introduce our other guest for today, who is Reverend Derek McCoy. Reverend McCoy is a transformational executive leader and organizational consultant who's been working as a media commentator and urban renewal activist. He's founded the Urban Leadership Alliance, and most recently was the executive vice president of the Center for Urban Renewal and Education, which works to fight poverty and restore dignity through the message of faith, freedom, and personal responsibility. So, Reverend McCoy, glad to have you here with us as well.
It's absolutely great to be with you as well. Good to see you, Dr. Jeff, and our wonderful host there.
Well, thank you, guys. We wanted to start off with a question. As we mentioned at the outset, this is Juneteenth, which is celebrates a really significant day in history. And I'd like for you each to have the opportunity to just say, what would you like for believers to know on this day in the midst of the racial tension of our times? And either one can start. I'm sure we're used to talking over each other, so just join right in.
Sure, I'll jump right in. I know Dr. Anderson has some great thoughts around this as well, but I think for many of us, it's a day that some are not familiar with. Some don't really know what it's about, but you need to understand this is really a liberation day, especially for Black America. Many talk about July 4th, 1776, and the whole aspect of America as a whole being free and winning their independence. At the same time, while Abraham Lincoln processed the Emancipation Proclamation that we all know him for, it wasn't until about 2.5 years later that Dr. Granger walked in and just said, hey, look, we have to now enforce what the government said. And it really wasn't until after the Civil War ended. So Texas got an opportunity to use those slaves. And, it's one of those things that I think for many people, it's a day which you can begin to think about and say, wow, I didn't know about this, but it's a great day for especially many Black Americans that understand this is really the Liberation Day that somehow has to coincide with the freedom that America has gotten, but really in our world, it's another real day of independence.
Thank you. Dr. Anderson?
I would I would just throw in there that it's a day where many black people in America are hangry, meaning happy and angry. You can imagine if you were put in prison for 30 years for a crime you didn't commit, and then DNA proved that you weren't even there and you weren't supposed to be in prison for 30 years, but then they say, now you can go free. You walk out of that prison, you're happy, you're no longer in a situation you should have never been put in because of injustice, but you're still angry because you lost 30 years of your life. And so Juneteenth is this mixture between happy and angry. So I'll just say, hangry.
Wow. Yeah, that's a really great way to put it. Dr. Anderson, when you see his books, you realize he is a master with words and descriptions and coming up with new words. You should have your own dictionary, Dr. Anderson, really. Yeah. As we dive into more discussion here, though, I wanted to have a poll of people who are watching right now, and there are hundreds who voted in that last poll, which is terrific. But how would you say your church is doing to helping bridge the racial divide? I'm sure we have a lot of different traditions here, but would you say it's doing very well, average, somewhat poorly, or very poorly? This is going to be a big part of our discussion here because the question that you have to ask Dr. Anderson here in just a moment directly relates to what the church's role in this.
Yeah, let's see here.
So far, the votes as they fly in, the numbers do change a little bit, but right now I'd say about a third say they're doing very well, a third say average, 20% somewhat well. Okay, now very well is going down. So it adjusts as more and more people come in, but it looks like it's average at best for most churches. And some are doing somewhat poorly and some are doing very poorly.
Yes, yeah, which is concerning because as we know, as we're supposed to be ambassadors for Christ on earth, how we learn to do that is through the church and the church engagement with that. So that's really where that conversation should start and where that movement should start. But Dr. Anderson, I want to ask you, Dr. Jeff mentioned some of your books. I'd like to ask you more about your book, Gracism, and can you tell us a little bit more about what you've written about and even about that term?
Sure, I'd love to tell you about Gracism. I'll also tell you that as we're speaking about churches addressing the racial divide, I just did a sermon this past Sunday called Little Did I Know. And I would encourage you to go on YouTube and just put in @Anderson Speaks and watch Little Did I Know. It's just 30 minutes, but I think you'll get a real sense of where a person like me fits on this scale of trying to address leadership and trying to address the racial divide while being a pastor of a large multicultural megachurch. So Gracism is a word that comes from two other words. A bad one, racism, and a good one, grace. The bad one, to speak, act, or think negatively about someone else solely based on their color, class, or culture. That's racism, simply defined. And then grace is God's unmerited favor on humankind that he cannot deserve, he doesn't earn, he cannot even repay, but God extends this grace to another race. Well, from those two words, a new term emerges, gracism. A term that I coined because really I believe that gracism is the solution to racism. The G stands for God, and God. If you put God in front of any problem, he'll give you the strength to get through it and the solution to it. But the definition of gracism then is to extend positive favor to other people, regardless of their color, their class, or their culture, or maybe even because of it. But this is what God did. He's the biggest gracist of us all. And that's what we ought to be. And I believe that's what the answer to racism is.
Wow, thank you. I love that term, gracism. We could sure use a big
Amen.
Dose of grace right now in this time. Reverend McCoy, so many of us are trying to figure out how to respond to the things we see happening in our society as individuals, but also at a social and even political level. And not every discussion should end at politics, but they shouldn't end before they get to politics either. So there are a lot of opinions, there's a lot of division, there are a lot of terms that we hear in the media right now, like white privilege and systemic racism. Is it even possible for people of all racial backgrounds to come together without embracing what seems like a political agenda?
Well, I definitely appreciate the question, and it's one of those questions that is, you could take so many different ways. First and foremost, I just appreciate what Dr. Anderson just mentioned in terms of racism. I think that's the right way to approach things from a biblical perspective. When we're talking about these issues, obviously these issues did not start yesterday, and they're not going to be finished tomorrow. And so we have to understand that there's a long-term trajectory that we're going to have to really tackle these issues with. But today is probably what I would call a woke moment or an awakening moment, where we are having to say, this is confronting us. These are the issues that are in our face. When you look at terms, Dr. Jeff, about white privilege and systemic racism, and you look at all of the avenues that go to that, and then you begin to understand, man, people from different racial backgrounds all over the country, and sometimes we quickly adhere to a political perspective quickly and run down that lane. And I don't think that's the right way to go about this at all. This is not a political issue. This is a real heart issue about people and human dignity and where people are. And so if we address it that way, we're going to have to begin to look at it in this light. Before we get to a political stance, we need to get to a human stance, meaning, how do you see other people? How do you value life? How do you value humanity? The issue with the George Floyd that we're forced in front of right now, and that 8 minutes and 46 seconds, is not the issue of, wow, well, he might have had some background issues. He might have had all these different items going on. No, it's an issue that we're looking at a man's life sitting there on the ground, on the ground face down, with a person's knee on his neck, and we're all watching him expire. We're all watching him die in front of us. There should be something heart-wrenching that grabs all of us at a heart level that says, that's not right. That's injustice. That is not right. It shouldn't go on. And regardless of what we believe his background is, regardless of what got him into the circumstance, regardless of any other issue, that's just injustice. And that's the thing, I believe, for us that has to flip in our switch and says, that's the thing that God has to prick for all of us. So to answer your question, and I don't know if I'm really getting to it, but I think we got to start there. And then we do have to go down the aisle of understanding, what are the things that we embrace? What are the value systems that we embrace? And we can dig into that a little bit more, but that's not where we got to start. We got to understand, human life is human life. Many of us deal with it this way, and I'll say it this way. Many of us say, I espouse to a pro-life position or something like that. Well, we put a qualifier on it saying pro-life. Why don't we just espouse to a life position? Why don't we espouse to something that says, I believe that every single life matters? And I know this is a heated debate. If you extract black and you put all and all these different things, it gets complicated. But I mean, for me, it's a thing of understanding the intrinsic value of a life, because God put that there. God breathed life into my own body. And so I have to accept that and honor other people the same way. And then from that point, we got to look at, is there systemic issues? Yeah, there's some real issues that we got to tackle. Is there privilege? Yep, there's some privilege going on that we got to tackle. But I think this is an awareness moment for everybody, so that we understand, let's start at simple principles that we can tackle, much like Dr. Anderson saying, grace and race, and putting those things together. We got to look at love and truth and grace, and understanding how those things affect how we deal with other people in everyday life. Romans is real clear on it. So I'll stop there for a second.
Mm-hmm. No, it's good. You start with what Christians should be excelling at, which is recognizing that every person bears God's image. And when injustice occurs to a person, this injustice has occurred for all of society. And then we act based on that.
Right.
And we'll get into a little bit more later, because I think what people get so angry and frustrated, and then some people say, well, we should overthrow society. Others say, no, this is the only society in which this could ever be addressed, and things like that. But first, starting with the realization that we are image bearers of God and that our lives are precious.
That's a really
Can I jump in there for a second, Dr. Jeff?
Yeah.
The book Gracism has 7 sayings or principles that come out of 1 Corinthians 12. And the first one is that I will lift you up. And we have to understand, in answer to the question you asked, next to what my dear brother, Reverend McCoy, said, and that is, yes, we need to look at the scripture, we need to look at our heart, and we need to look at each other as humans, no doubt. But to your question of politics, I'm becoming more convinced now that the white church has used politics to weaponize injustice against black people. And so then the only way that we're going to fix this is to also have politics to undo what it has done. And white folk, and I'm just saying this in general, of course, but white folk are using guns and laws and the military and the Bible to continue white supremacy, but to spiritualize it so it seems like everything's fine. And then when the black community says, no, it's not fine, we want to change this politically, all of a sudden evangelical leaders want to say, don't bring politics into the church. So
Right.
what is it? Is it politics in the church to suppress black people, or is it no politics in the church? Why do my white brothers and sisters get to choose what issues they want to make political? So if it's abortion or gay folk, then all of a sudden we need to get political. We need Supreme Court justices, we need laws, we need all this other stuff. We better get political. But as soon as you talk about anything that affects my life as a black man or people that look like me, all of a sudden, Pastor, don't get so political. Do you see the injustice in that?
Oh yeah, I can see that, and it's interesting how that's kind of the nature of politics, right? That you want to use it when it serves your interests, and then you don't want it to be used when it doesn't serve your interests. Reverend McCoy, you were going to jump in on that, I think.
Yeah, I was as well. This is great, and I love what Dr. Anderson says, and really, I think Martin Luther King said this well when he was talking about two Americas in a speech at Grosse Pointe High School many years ago in Michigan, right outside of the suburbs of Detroit, or right outside of Detroit and the suburbs of Michigan. He was talking about two Americas, and really he was talking majority to a white audience. And he began to tell this white audience, while you get inflamed and enraged on the issues of a Bull Connor and seeing the hoses being poured on the black people, and you immediately jump out, and what we saw is that there was an increase in participation by whites in those issues and battling those issues. But then on the other side of it, when the policy began to change and policy issues began to come up, there was an absence. And he says, we have to deal with this point where we needed you then and we need you there. And so it's one of those things which I think I'm one of these guys that maybe I'm too optimistic, but I believe this way, that there is perspective that is to be gained and value to be gained perhaps on both sides of these aisles, because you can't call one completely ignorant and the other one completely ignorant. That leaves a big gap. And oftentimes, me being a person who's worked on the Hill at times, me a person who's been involved in the trenches on a lot of these issues, I look at it as there are people that I've talked to personally on the Hill when it comes to issues, even like Dr. Anderson was talking about, on maybe one side of the aisle that says, well, I believe that way, but it's too politicized on the other side, so I can't give in or vote that way because I think, while I believe in it, I think that's too political. And I'm sitting there thinking, well, you're a sitting congressman, shouldn't you get involved? And on the other side of the aisle, you hear the same exact thing. You hear Republican congressmen say, well, I believe in what they're saying, but I'm not going to get involved in it because that's too political. And I hear it on both sides, and sometimes it is very frustrating to understand that we have similar belief patterns or similar beliefs, but we gotta fix this because there are issues that are fundamental to our cultures that are so important that we have to look at how do we bring this divide and bridge this divide. And like Dr. Anderson said, in the church, we haven't done the best job at it. And I'll give applause to Dr. Anderson here. he has one of the most multi-ethnic, multiracial churches in the country. And so it's one of the things that you understand. He has been able to bridge something that not a lot of churches are able to do. And so I think even for us looking at it now, we have to figure this out, because you can't stand on two sides of the aisle and just yell at each other and think we're going to make any kind of progress. That's not going to happen. We got to figure out, how do we synergize? And it used to be a day that, some would say, well, they're a blue dog Democrat and they're this kind of Republican, and they actually work together. But so we got to figure that out. And that's where I find that it's a real sticky hole right now in this. And I do understand, with a lot of people's perspective, that they want to say, well, that's too far gone. And there are issues that are being tagged even to this issue that is too far gone, that I won't stand for. Well, I would be a black man standing here and say, I believe, yeah, Black lives do matter. At the same time, am I standing for the organizational fundamental principles? No, I'm not. But there are a lot of things around that we got to be able to say, here's what we see. And this is where discernment kicks in for a Christian, right? Where as a Christian, we got to see through all the noise and say, what are the core issues and what is the heart of the people crying out for? And that's the heart where Martin Luther King said in another speech that says, the cup of endurance begins to run low. And that's what we're seeing now when these issues systemically happen over and over again. That cup of endurance is kind of running low. And that's why people are so outraged, enraged. And you're seeing this thing where he was like saying, you're hangry. And, there's lament and joy on the day of Juneteenth.
Yeah, can I interrupt here? I see we have a question coming in from Jean Paul that you kind of prophetically answered just now, but I kind of want to add on to it. He's asking questions about better understanding of the racial divide. And when everything went down the last couple of months, I noticed that when the video came out of the killing of George Floyd, there was universal outcry at this injustice. We were all horrified. But in the wake of that, there was also this outcry of systemic racism. And for many, that was like a new concept. And we grew up in neighborhoods where we just weren't aware of this issue. And so this has been hugely educational the last few months as that awareness has grown. But for so many, they're looking at this and they're thinking, well, I'm not racist, and no one I know is racist. And I even have African-American friends who, and maybe it's my fault I haven't started the conversation, but I also just haven't heard of this kind of injustice on a daily basis for them. So as we're trying to understand more about the racial divide that's present and about the systemic injustice, can you give us some real tangible examples of where do we look and how might this be going down in our neighborhoods without us even realizing it? What's a starting point for us?
Well, if you can imagine a teenager who's been screaming and screaming and screaming and screaming, but the parents just haven't heard it, and then finally they punch a wall, and then the parents are like, oh my gosh, what's wrong with you? Let's sit down and talk, honey. The person has been screaming for so long, but it's not until they damage their own property. It's not until they throw their cell phone. You paid $1,000 for that cell phone. I mean, and they're like, how could people damage their own property? Well, listen, when you are angry, you do things that, get the attention of people around you, but also it's because of what's coming out inside of you. So when you say, where do you see it? Think about this one event where you have a multicultural group along with a bunch of black youths in front of the White House, and the president, 20 minutes before a curfew, sends out the law enforcement and military to push those people away who are peacefully protesting so he can walk across the street and stand in front of a church, hold up a Bible with a bunch of white folk around him to say, I'm in control. Think about what that communicates to the psyche of the young black man who's saying, I got it. We understand. Government, Bible, guns. Got it. We'll be in our place right now. Think about what that does to the psyche of someone that looks like me or my son or my daughter. But think about the other side. Other people are like, oh my gosh, yes, religious freedom, get away, all those protesters, there's so much disorder, so you can only imagine the view is so different. And so what I want are my white brothers and sisters, 30% of whom, make up the constitution of my church. What I want them to see is, what is life like now through the psyche of a young black person? And if they can get into the psyche of a young black person, then they won't have any problem thinking through, how do I define systemic racism? Just begin to look at it through the psyche of a young black person. So when you see that one event, and I can give you 25 of them if you want, but that one event, if you can see it the way I just explained it to you, that changes the script completely, does it not?
Yes, yeah, that's
Because
hugely helpful.
you know, we talk about empathy a lot at Summit, and you're learning to learn to see something from somebody else's perspective doesn't mean that you embrace everything about their perspective or their worldview, but when you see through somebody else's eyes, you in a way see twice as much, right?
Yeah.
So that's why we teach at Summit Ministries. We teach people to have conversations, to ask before you try to tell. Otherwise, you're just re-entrenching rather than really trying to understand.
Right. And on that note, Dr. Anderson, do you have like a kind of a list of do's and don'ts in how to have conversations and kind of bring about that racial reconciliation? What are some like guidelines for that?
Well, I do believe that comprehension begins with conversation. So conversations are very important. There is an old African proverb that says, from afar, I thought he was a monster. But when he got closer, I saw he was an animal. When he got closer, I realized he was a human being. But when we were face to face, I realized he was my brother. You know, distance demonizes those people. They're monsters. Maybe they're humans, but half humans, you know, that sort of thing. But when we're face to face, comprehension begins with conversation. So I think that's very important, Brooke, and thank you for asking me that. But so far as a few ways to engage toward racial healing, a few do's and don'ts. I mean, one of the do's, and this is what I've said to my people, one of the do's is do stay in relationships with others who are different than you across color lines, and don't revert to racial isolation. Because what happens is when you have these situations, people are polarized by fear. And then they're politicized, which is fueled by their anger. And before you know it, they're radicalized because of injustice. And as a result, they want to be in the racially isolated groups where they can have the echo chamber that pretty much makes them feel safe in their beliefs. And I tell black folk, don't do it. Don't go back to the black church. I know how tempting it is to get your wounds licked, but this is not what God has called us to as a ministry. White folk, don't go to your own place and stay there. Okay, you can go for a while, but come back out. To my Asians and Hispanics, I need you to step into this. To my Arabs and my Jews, I need us all to be a part of this, because it's right here for such a time as this that you say, where you go, I go. Your people are my people. We're in this together at the foot of the cross, looking up to Jesus, knowing that we have the same Heavenly Father, which makes us brothers and sisters. And this is what we've been called to. So one of the very first things I say is stay in relationships. Now, for some people, they're like, oh yeah, I'll stay in relationships with people who are different than me. And I say, praise God. But there are others more increasingly, and I know Reverend McCoy knows this, who are saying, you know what, Doc, I'm done. I'm done with teaching white people. I'm done with consulting white people. I'm done with somebody who spills soup at the party and it goes all over the floor and on everybody's shoes. And then they want to say, oh my gosh, there's a mess here. Hello, sir. What can I do to handle this mess? Well, the guy who gets the soup on his shoes is going to say, you could clean your mess up. So let me ask other people, how do you clean this mess up? Are you looking to me to tell you what to do and what not to do? You might want to start by admitting that you're the one that dropped the soup and that my shoes are soaked. Maybe a new pair of shoes. Maybe we'll clean it up. Let's get down and clean it together. It's not about blame. At first, I think it's just about acceptance and saying, hello, I dropped the soup. There's a mess here. But don't walk away and then point to everybody in the room and say, well, you know what? If you were more committed and more responsible, then you'd have a clean house. Okay, I'm done preaching. I'm sorry, but you asked me a couple of do's and don'ts. Okay, I'm done.
If you
Don't
bring
preach
somebody
on a call at the summit. I'm sorry.
if you bring somebody on who's a pastor, you're going to get a little. No, but that's really that's a vivid analogy. Yeah. So I know other people may have questions, and if you do, go ahead and type them in. And we're not going to be able to get to all of them, obviously, because of the discussion. But we'll just try to get to as many as we can.
Reverend McCoy, I also wanted to kind of toss that same question to you of how do we facilitate authentic conversations? Like, do you have more to add to that?
Yeah, I do. And let me just say this. I'm going to say this one real quickly because conversation, he's right on. Do have those. I'm going to give you a quick analogy. And I often use this analogy this way. There's two pair of glasses. So let's say this pair of glasses was the glasses that I came through my mama's womb with, meaning this is the pair of glasses that was on me when I was born. And this, it represents who I am. It represents my ethnicity and everything else. But somewhere along the way, once I was born, I grew up, I accepted Christ into my life. And guess what? He adopted me into his family. He said, hey, Derek, you know those glasses? I need to switch them out for you because now you get new glasses. And these glasses are glasses of his perspective, his kingdom, what he believes, and how I should see things now as an adopted son in his family and in his kingdom. It says we're supposed to be sons and daughters, right? And so now I get to maybe wear these glasses on top in terms of my old ethnicity and everything else. But my first lens has to be through the lens of what Christ has done in my life and who he is. And so I look at it this way. I can walk around all day like this, but my number one response is I got to change my lens and look not just as a black man, but really look as I'm a Christian man who happens to be black. Now, I tell people that all the time. They say, wow, that's good. Now, let me just challenge you, because as a white person, as a Latino person, as a Jewish person, as an Arab person, you got to do the same thing if you come to Christ. You got to change your lens, and you got to be in a place where you say, you know what? I'm no longer this person. My ethnicity is not how I first see things, but it's through my adoption in the family of God that now I see it. And so I think for us blacks, sometimes we can do that, but sometimes whites say, I don't need to change anything. I'm good. And I said, no, you got to change the lens just like I changed the lens, because we see things in an improper way. And so when we're talking about what do you do and having authentic conversations, it's being able to have those conversations. It's being able to say, I changed the lens, but at the same time, when I change that lens, I need to be able to say, man, I'm processing this way. And let me say this way, I've had some great conversations over these last few weeks. One conversation I had with a wonderful person who I work alongside of, she said, hey, I want to be able to ask you a real question. And she said, please don't hate me. I said, you ain't got nothing to worry about because I'm not going to hate you. She said, was there real issues in this George Floyd thing in terms of his own background? Is this? He says, I feel like if I ask that up front, it's going to be wrong and I'll be hated on. I said, I appreciate you asking it because it's something you're asking and inquiring about. Authentic conversations around your dining room table, around the barbecue, around, after church at a coffee place or whatever may be the case, have to happen where you get to ask those questions. You got to be able to say, David, why do y'all shout like you do at sometimes in black churches? Why do you do certain things? And the same thing, I should have the freedom to ask you, why didn't you clean up my shoes like he said? But yet you looked at me like I was the butler at the place and said, you supposed to clean up the shoes. So, I got a lot to say, and hopefully you understand, but it's one of those things where you got to understand that as we process through this, we all have to change. And to be able to do that, we're going to have really honest conversations, which let me just say the first, it's hard to do it. It's hard to press into that. It's offensive at times. It's volatile at times. And sometimes we want to, again, wear that political badge on our sleeve so deeply that as soon as they cross a line that I don't agree with, I'm out. But we'll never get progress done and we'll never move forward. And I don't think that's the kingdom mandate for us if we do it that way. So, there's a lot of ways to do it, but, just ask for honesty, ask for those things. In a small group, I used to lead small groups for our church. And one of the things is we used to have a little covenant we signed. What's in the small group stays in the small groups. The confidentiality in that group is in that group. And so you got to have people that don't look like you in the room, whether it's in your business, whether it's in your family dining room table, whether it is around you at your job, whatever may be the case. Look for the people that don't look like you and begin to engage in conversation so that you can learn something, not so much that they get privileged to be your friend, but maybe you need to understand something about them that you don't know, and maybe even take them out to eat or go have some conversation. So I'll do that. That's just a step. I do think as well there are steps that we can do right now with this. Like I told you about even the two America speech. We're going to have to show up at some point on some of these real issues that happen and say, guess what? We're beginning to change these issues, and this is going to be something that changes. We need everybody to participate, because one of the other things that I did not mention earlier that Martin Luther King did say is it said, white and black are tied together in this. It is not a separate thing. We cannot do it alone. But there is something that we're going to be tied together. And I would just be the one that includes everybody. some of my closest buddies and friends are Latino. And I've learned so much about the culture and some of those different things in some of my own pastoring roles. It has been a learning process for me to go through and to live life with them a little bit. And I've gotten to grow from that. So I'm a better man because of it.
Yeah. I really love that encouragement to just show up. Even if you're worried, you're going to be unsure at first, just show up. And it was actually really helpful analogy was shared with me. We've experienced loss in my family, and it was so meaningful when that happened, that so many of our friends didn't really know what to say in the face of our grief, but they showed up. They were there, and they were clumsy sometimes in what they said, but they cared, and that was evidenced by them being present. And I feel like it's the same thing here. Like, even if maybe we haven't had this kind of conversation before, if we're just willing to show up and kind of find our feet, that's just a great place to start for maybe people who don't know.
And you can't fake showing up. And the fact that so many young white folk and others are showing up in the streets is heartening. It's encouraging. And even you, Dr. Jeff and Brooke, along with everybody that's on this call, being here and showing up and having this conversation. No one's going to agree with everything, but you'll agree with our spirit, and our spirit will agree with you. And I don't know about you, Reverend McCoy, but I'm heartened just the fact that a summit is showing up to say, let's talk about this.
Yeah.
You're so right, David. I appreciate that. And I think young leaders, especially that are out here that are listening to us, we made mistakes along the way. We might not have done all this stuff right, but I tell you something, it's the baton is in your hand, and you get the opportunity to really make a difference in your culture. I sign most of my letters when it's official is together we can make a difference. And I think that is so right, David. I mean, we show up together.
Yeah.
One thing I was going to mention, Brooke, just briefly, is to add to this is, at Summit we talk a lot about talking about the talk. So to be able to say, okay, I feel really awkward right now because I want to ask a question, and I think it's going to come out all bended and twisted, and I'm a little embarrassed, but can you just hang with me in order to ask the question? Yeah. And having that kind of a conversation allows you, we live in a world where people have different perspectives on all kinds of things. It's not just race, it's a dozen different things, right? If you have three churches, you have four doctrinal statements, right? You have the man on the desert island who had three buildings. He had his house, he had his church, he had where he used to go to church, right? And he was the only guy. But if you can say, all right, let's talk. It doesn't hurt me at all to ask you, how do you see this? Yeah. And then compare how we see things.
Yeah.
So,
Hey, Dr. Jeff.
Yeah.
And I know, I'll just jump in for one quick second. I know one of our conversations from years ago, that when we first met, it was a tough conversation. My two boys had walked through the summit themselves. And, we sat at the dinner table, didn't really know each other too much. And I knew who you were because I saw your video at the summit. But it was one of those things. You said, hey, how are you doing? I said, I'm doing great. And I think I said something to the point of, we did the cordial items. And then I said, do you want to have a real conversation, or do you want to just chat here at dinner and be nice? And you know what? You were really open. And I got to commend you, man. I still think about that day. And I commend you so much. You said, no, let's have a real conversation. And I jumped in. And I probably told you some stuff that was a little uncomfortable because of my own sons, while they had a glowing experience and learned so much and dramatically life-changing for them from a summit perspective. there were some things that could be tweaked, and to make sure that they're sensitive to our culture a little bit and understanding how we how we think and what are some of the things that are said. And so it was a great experience and a great exchange, and I just got to commend you for that, man. I really appreciate that, because you sat there and you were open and you took it. And I said, I don't know if I'm ever going to hear from this guy again, but hey, you call back later, and I got a great friend. I appreciate you.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, do you want to hear what's really going on, or do you want to just stay at a surface level? And I think most people, we kind of are like, oh, that's actually a hard question, because I don't really want my world to be disturbed, but if I'm going to, it's not about me. Mm-hmm. Am I going to be ready to minister to a world that's outside of me? And anyway, Derek, I love you. Thank you for that. That was, and it really was the beginning of a great friendship. So thank you.
Fantastic. Yeah. We have questions just pouring in. I'd like to start with one of them. This is from Catherine. Catherine asks, how can white people fight for racial justice without succumbing to that white savior complex?
Wow.
Humility. Yeah, I mean, we need white folk and others, because this is not just a black problem, it's an American problem. And so I think when we see it as our problem, then it's not like, oh, that little black kid's life matters. It's really all of our lives do matter, and that little black kid is my little brother. And so when I see that little black kid as my little brother, it changes my ethos, it changes my psyche, it changes the way that I would actually advocate for a family member. And so when Trayvon Martin was killed, I have a 17-year-old boy who wears a hoodie the same month, that Trayvon was born, he was born. And then 7 years later, now my son's 25, and Ahmaud Arbery's going running. And my son is about to go out running. And so there's a 7-year swing. So we remember Trayvon, we remember Ahmaud Arbery, because they're exact same age. My 22-year-old who's on the streets of LA protesting because he's an entertainer in Hollywood. His dad, I'm going out on the streets and protest. It's amazing out here. Can you see all this? I'm like, yes, son. He goes, have they ever done this before? And I'm like, son, Rodney King, when I was your age. Same song, different verse, a little bit louder, a little bit worse. And so I think it's important when we see our sons, our daughters, our family members, we come to it more humbly, and we come to it with what Jeff said earlier, and that was empathy. So humility and empathy and authenticity will trump any kind of savior complex. The savior complex comes from a more superiority place. So if I am seeing myself as superior to you, then yes, the complex is going to come out. But if I don't see myself as more superior, if I see myself as humble, authentic, and truly empathetic, then people know when you really care.
Yeah, thank you. We have another question here from Jim, and it's a really great question. So how can you deny cultural Marxism and critical race theory as a whole, but provide a better solution or tool from a Christian worldview foundation? And I think that's such a helpful question, because Christians really feel like they're kind of in this rough spot where these are life and death issues, and we care, but it seems like the situation's really being framed and the discussion's being framed by organizations that maybe even have like an anti-Christian perspective and might even be trying to eradicate Christianity. So how do we engage and maybe correct that narrative without coming across as uncaring or like we're not being sensitive to the injustices that are being done?
Yeah, I'd like to jump in on that one, and I'd love to hear Dr. Anderson and Reverend McCoy, what your thoughts are as well. At Summit Ministries, and we'll have a new book coming out this fall, which really helps me in this. It's written by Jason Jimenez called Challenging Conversations. And he said, most people tend to go on a one-dimensional spectrum from avoider to aggressor. Avoider, you have your truth, I have my truth. Let's just agree to disagree, things like that. aggressors are, no, you need to hear my point of view, and it's looking for that mic drop moment, right? It's the so-and-so, watch so-and-so crush his opposition in 30 seconds, with one statement or whatever. So we tend to think of it as one-dimensional. We're saying go to two dimensions. Instead of being an avoider or being an aggressor, be an advocate. Be an advocate for two things. Be an advocate for the truth, but also be an advocate for the other person. From a biblical viewpoint, conflict is not facing off against one another. It is learning to walk alongside one another on this journey that God has us on. So I think you have to start in a personal way. I can't affect the whole nation, but what is my life like? What is my community? What's going on here? Second thing, I think you have to inform yourself. And Jim's question is really important. At Summit Ministries, we tell our students, if you want to be a leader, you've got to be a reader, right? Yeah, right. You've been indoctrinated, but ideas have histories. And there is a big question out there, and Reverend McCoy and I've talked about this, but what book is going to guide your life? Is it going to be the Bible, or is it going to be the Communist Manifesto, or what? And those are, there is really a battle of ideas that's part of this as well. But I think the third thing is to express curiosity. We're teaching our students, have your first response be 5 conversation-altering words. Tell me more about that. Okay, and then, hey, how did you arrive at that conclusion? You said you have to overthrow all of society in order to solve this problem. Do you think that's the whole story, right? Or what would lead you to say that? And then what is the basis? How do you know that is true? Those kinds of questions. Where do you get your information? Those are questions that anybody can ask in any conversation, even if you haven't studied, but don't forget to study. We need to be in Scripture. We need to be looking at the ideas that rule the world. So, anyway.
I couldn't agree with you more, and don't mean to be a contrarian here either. I'm having graduated from Moody Bible Institute, an intern at Willow Creek Community Church, and then a pastor for the last 20-some years. I believe in the Bible, and I teach it every day. I'm on the radio in D.C. every day, and I take phone calls. And yesterday I got a phone call from a white guy named Jeff from Annapolis, Maryland. And he says, I watched the funeral of George Floyd, and the preacher said that Jesus was a young black man who was killed by the government. And I just don't understand that. Can you help me understand, Dr. Anderson? Because that's not what my wife and I believe. And I said, sure, Jeff, no problem. I said, first of all, how old was Jesus when he was crucified? He was 33. I said, is 33 young or old to you? He said, oh boy, I guess I'm really old. I said, okay. So you agree with that part of the statement that he was young, right? And then killed by the government. Who actually killed Jesus? He goes, well, God allowed him to be killed for my sins. And I said, that's true theology, but who actually killed him? He goes, well, Pontius Pilate allowed the Roman soldiers. I said, exactly. So do you think Pontius Pilate and the soldiers were representatives of the government? He says, yes. I said, oh, okay, so 2 out of 3 ain't bad. You're okay with the young, you're okay with the government killing them. Yes, I guess I am. I said, what about the black one? He goes, well, that's why I'm calling you, because I assume that Jesus is white. I said, why would you assume that? He goes, well, Mary and him were born like in Israel, and all the pictures I see growing up, he was always white. I said, exactly. Now, why do I tell you that story? And I'll tell you how it ended. But the reason I tell you that story is because it's not just teaching the Bible, it's how we teach it. It's who's teaching it and what they're interpreting. And so if you could, again, imagine the psyche of a young black boy growing up seeing that the Savior is European all of his life, and those that are around him are European that are successful, what does that do to the psyche of a little black child? Or what does it do to the psyche of a little white child? If the Savior is white, I mean, could you imagine if the Savior was black? That might change my whole religion. But think about that. And so I simply asked him, I said, where was Jesus born? Okay, Israel. Okay, and then where did he escape to with Mary and Joseph? And he wasn't sure. I said a place called Egypt. I said, now let me ask you a question. What continent is Egypt on? He wasn't quite sure. I said, let me tell you, Africa. Okay, so I said, so if you had to choose that Jesus was born on an African continent, or maybe in an American continent or a European continent or something like that, which one would you say? Well, there's a bit of a struggle there. I'm like, let me help you with the answer. African. So if he were closer in color to being brown or being white, like from Norway or something, what do you think he'd be closer to? And, he finally got to the point where he's like, wow, I guess I just never thought of that. So again, it's not about simply, trying to win an argument. It really is asking ourselves the question, what is the gospel? How do we interpret scripture? Because scriptures had been interpreted that the mark of Cain means black people. The scripture's been interpreted, that the curse of Ham meant that black people were cursed. This is like in the Schofield Reference Bible in just the last generation. And so I think that part is important as well. Anyway.
Wow.
Yeah, that's usually helpful.
I remember when I was a young man, I found some literature that talked about that exact point. And it was a tough thing for me because I saw that here's somebody who was Christian writing this literature and using it as a platform to create a racial divide on purpose. And so it was pretty startling to see that and to realize, wow, that we need really good Bible interpretation. So.
And leaders are readers, right? But the question is, what are they reading?
Right.
Because what kind of leader will you be, Brooke, if the last 10 books you read were all from white authors that are saying the same thing? You see, that's the leader you become. And so it's important if you want to be a certain kind of leader, if you want to be a multicultural, diverse leader, then you have to be a diverse reader. So I would say diverse leaders are diverse readers. I wouldn't just say leaders are readers because I can tell the other side leaders are readers and they're just going to be socialists. And so what kind of leader do you want to be? I'll just add that to the mix.
Yeah, that's usually helpful.
Good.
Are you sorry you invited me on yet? Just tell me. Am I embarrassing Reverend McCoy?
Hey, I was going to say,
This is great.
no, I was going to say, and this is why I love this brother. He's going to tell it like it is. He's going to be truthful and honest, but he lives it. And I appreciate him about that. And he's right, because if we don't take into account various viewpoints in our learning, we miss the boat entirely. And that's often the times what I see over and over and over again. They would call me a good guy who, definitely is on the conservative side of things. But let me help you understand, that does not define who I am by any stretch of the imagination. I am a born believer of Christ first and foremost, and I am still at my age wanting to be open and learning and responsive, because even as I grow old, if I can't cry and if I can't get on my knees because I'm corrected and I've learned something new and Jesus has taught me something new, shame on me. And this is ironic that this conversation is happening, because we just had this conversation the other night at my dinner table with my own kids, because I'm just like Dr. Anderson over here. My kids were the same age as an Ahmaud Arbery about, and I looked at that in a very personal way. And so, but when you start looking at around this and you start talking about, well, where did you get this thing? Well, I grew up originally Catholic, is where I came into, some level of religious faith. And man, that's nothing but Michelangelo and his painting and everything else around it. And so you miss it. But when you start going overseas and when you start learning some other things, reading detail, he's exactly right. And I think that's the pause that people need to give to this, because we don't know all the answers. We don't know everything. People need to understand, you don't know everything. Just because you have a preconceived notion, you do not know everything. And you have to learn, and you have to keep learning and keep learning and keep learning over and over again, so that you have this diversity of opinion and thought.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And know who you are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Gosh, we're going to push this a little bit. I'd love to get just a few more questions in, because we have to just pouring in. I feel like this question kind of falls a little bit into the whataboutism category, so to speak, but we say, if racism is defined as thinking negatively about a person based on the color of their skin, then it seems solely based, then it seems like there's racism against Caucasians being expressed currently. How does this fit into the conversation?
So that is a simple definition of racism that doesn't really include the depth of institutional and structural racism, but it begins with a speech, an act, or a thought to negatively think about somebody else solely based on their color, class, or culture. And so I would say that we shouldn't do that whether we're blacks thinking about whites or whether we're whites thinking about blacks. But when you're dealing with racism, that is structurally whites toward blacks in America. Now, you have other issues between different cultures, but when we're talking about racism, it's the structure as well as the speech and the thought that goes with the superiority complex against black people. Now, having said that, that's not true about all whites. And it's not true about all blacks. It's not like all blacks are perfect. And so I think when we make statements like white people or black people, we do need to give disclaimers like many or most or it's not all, because you don't want people to think that all of them are pushed into one corner. So I would concede that.
Good.
Okay, that's really helpful.
Yeah. Well, I know a lot of people are wanting to ask questions, and they're coming here through magic and mathematics. They're on the screen right here.
Yeah, it's amazing. If we can squeeze just a few more in there, I think we should. We have another question, kind of almost as a follow-up to that, somewhat from Brandon. How do you explain systemic racism to someone who doesn't really believe that it exists?
I would say just study Dylan Roof, who's probably your age. Dylan Roof was a white man in his young 20s, late teens, who went into a black church and shot 9 black people while they were praying after having written a white manifesto. So he wrote it down so everybody could see it. Then he went into this church in Charleston. It just happened a couple years ago. And killed all these people, right? And then guess what he did? He got arrested and they took him to Burger King before he went to prison. George Floyd didn't even make it into the police car. Sandra Bland was manhandled for smoking a cigarette. Eric Garner was choked out his life because he was selling individual cigarettes. These people didn't even make it and black people don't want criminals to run free. All right, they just want to live. I mean, Dylan Roof got to go get a burger. So tell me there's not a problem with the system of the way police treat white folk and the way police treat unarmed black folk. Let me ask you another question. And Brandon, this is not coming against you in any way. You asked for examples, so I want to help you out here. Think of a bunch of white folk with guns going to the state house saying, we want to get out of this coronavirus lockdown so we can go to church, go to our bars, go back to work and make money. Think about that. Now, I don't have a problem with that, but let me ask you a question. If a bunch of black folk went to the state house with guns, what do you think would have happened to them? They're being killed with no guns. So this gives you examples of how the structure protects, cares for, and even gets a burger for white folk as opposed to black folk. So again, it's generally speaking, but those are just a few examples. I could give you about 23 others.
Wow. Well,
I think
I was just going to mention Senator Tim Scott the other day was talking about this, and he was asked by a white Christian commentator, have you experienced this? And he said, I regularly experience this where I get pulled over for seemingly no reason in my car. And it was quite shocking, I think, for the audience to hear that this conservative senator who's black from South Carolina,
The only black senator
experiences this.
Yeah.
So, I'm sorry, Derek.
and I think, well, no, it's fine. And I think that's great to say. One of the things that's really important about this as well is maybe if the person can understand, if you designed a system, I mean, just you think about it personally, if they designed and created a business, or they created, let's say a business, in that business, you're going to make rules and regulations according to what? Probably according to how they think, according to what they think is best, and according to how things fit in their world and their experiences. Now, when you have that business that you've now designed, and how you think and how your experiences have compiled into this place, and how you think it's going to work best, and then all of a sudden you have to incorporate all these other people into this process. Well, you're going to say, are you going to change completely your business to say, now I got to change all my business rules and practices and principles to abide by these folks? Or do I now say, how am I going to deal with this? You guys got to conform to this. And really, what you're looking at when you talk about structural racism, because systemic racism is this. And let me just say this: you can make a case and prove that, well, there's not really systemic racism in the country based on statistics and numbers. The same time, in terms of the pro-life movement, you can make certain cases based on the Guttmacher results, because everybody knows in the pro-life side of the thing, only a fraction of the numbers are actually reported anyway. And so in the same similar perspective, you have this with the systemic side of it, only some numbers are reported. And so you can make the case it's not really existing. However, every last one of us, and Dr. David Anderson would be included, is that we understand there's a structural system that's built that does not necessarily work for us. We were told as young people and young men, you have to be better than the next guy. Not just the next guy that looks like him next to me, but also the next white guy. I got to be better. I got to be above reproach. I got to go harder, stronger, faster, just to get at even playing ground. Not to be, and so to open the door to be in places, even as we're talking about this discussion, not everybody's going to get this opportunity to sit here and have this dialogue, because there are some people who say, no, they don't fit the mold. I can't talk to them. And so you have a system that's built where we know, you mentioned Tim Scott, and but we would say, well, yeah, that's called DWB. And if you don't understand what DWB is, that's because you don't understand our culture. That's driving while black. And we got pulled over many a day in earlier teenage years, all the way through our adult years, just because of the color of our skin and driving. I've gotten pulled over with my family. Why are you pulling me over? No reason, I'm just checking you out. Well, that doesn't cut the mustard, sir. And so you have a system that's developed that they're seeing through. Again, to whoever asked that question, think about the lens. When you're looking through a certain lens, you're looking through your lens, and you got to switch your lens to help you see it differently. And I think that's the real point about this whole thing, because there's a system that's designed that has actually been supported, that we are to conform with the system. Just the same simple principles of, we started simply with, hey, 4th of July is coming up. Doesn't everybody want to celebrate 4th of July? There's a big soiree here in DC around the 4th of July all the time. But nobody ever mentions Juneteenth, and saying that's really the day of liberation for a lot of blacks, similar to the 4th of July, but for a whole group of people that were kept in a system again, just because it fit for them. It fit to have them continue working the Civil Rights War. The Civil War side of things. It fit for them to continue having working enslaved. So it's one of those things. It's a tough one to go at, but you got to change the lens.
Yes. Yeah. We have another question that just came in from Elijah. How do we acknowledge the historical trauma from slavery that was passed from generation to generation in Black America, but still encourage progress past a victim mentality? And either one of y'all can take a stab at that.
No, these are tough. These are tough questions. Yeah.
No, great question. And I think, how do you encourage progress? Well, we got to keep doing what we're doing. And I think that when we said this already, you got to show up for us. You got to show up for your brother. You got to show up for your sister. And when items of change are happening, discern through that process, but really be there for some folks that we can see real change. Change doesn't just happen at the White House. Let me just help everybody understand that. It's not just about a president. This is about in your local government, in your school system, in your local county, in your state, all the different places that you can begin to see real change to happen. I think the other side too is to make sure that when you're looking at change in that regards, that not only do you show up, but you also voice out and you make an opinion. There's ways to make commentary as far as writing. There's ways to engage other people in your community. There's ways to do a lot of things. So I'll just leave it there. I think Dr. Anderson is going to cover a lot of rest because I keep going. So I know we got time.
Well, I would just say again, if a bunch of people spilled the soup all over the place, maybe the question shouldn't be how do we make progress without a victim mentality. Maybe the question should be, what can we do to help clean this mess up? And part of it is let's do the research to find out, were we the ones that spilled the soup? And do the people who look like me, were they the ones that spilled the soup and burned the skin of other people and dirtied up the floor? And if so, maybe the question is, how can I How can I help make progress with those folk? And so it's not about the victim mentality, it's really about the victimizer's responsibility. Jesus is about healing those of us who have been victims, and that's all of us. We've been victims by the sin of Satan, but God also requires us to take responsibility for our sin, not to say, well, it really wasn't me, but it was Adam. We know that it's passed down from generation to generation, and racism is not a skin problem at the heart of it. We know it's a sin problem at the heart of it. And so I do think that people who have been victimized, whoever they are, okay? It can be a white woman in her 20s who's been victimized by her uncle for 10 years, all right? Yeah, does she need to get over it? Does she need to get counseling? Does she need to, pick herself up, and make a difference and get a job and a degree and stop, sitting around whining about what happened to her for 10 years? Sure, okay. But is it really me, the guy, that should be saying that to her? Really? I mean, should I be the one that should be saying to the 20-year-old girl who's been raped by her uncle for 10 years, you just really need to, that victim mentality, I think you need to do better. Mm-hmm. Yes, I already know that, the 20-year-old white girl is going to say. What she's looking for is not to be re-victimized by more men who look like her uncle. Thanks for inviting me. I'm sorry. I love being on this conversation, and I love the questions. I really do.
This is so good, and it's fun to be in a place where everybody in the conversation loves Jesus. We understand our sin nature. We understand that we're made in the image of God. Then we we start to bring up all of these questions and issues, and I just
this is hugely important.
Well, what?
Go ahead.
Oh yeah, I'm just going to say this really quickly. One of the other things too, when you can get involved and you can do it, you create systems that help people at the heart. Don't just try to, you can either further help them be a victim, or you can actually help create systems that help them move forward in their life. There's a way that Jesus talked about this over and over again in parables, and even teaching people how to fish. And so I believe it's one of those things that we can do that collectively together if we really think through some of those kind of ideas.
Yes. Yeah. I'd love to get to just one more before we move on to closing comments, but this is coming from Elizabeth, and it looks like Elizabeth is a freshman going into college, which is helpful to know. And she asks, how can I safely express my opinion on the riots and how those are kind of turned into a complicated thing without receiving backlash and being labeled by my peers? So how to respond to the complexity of the different protests and riots that are going on.
So was the question, how do I respond to it in like a positive way without being judged? Is it kind of like that?
I imagine that, like, as a freshman going into college, Elizabeth's going to be trying to figure out, how do I have these conversations? And we've talked a little bit about this before, but things, especially like the protests, are can be hijacked by people who are from out of town and are kind of turning it into their own agenda. So, like, how does she engage in these conversations and maybe express unpopular opinions on things like the protests in a way that's helpful?
Yeah, I think it's helpful to ask people how they feel, ask them their thoughts, and then I think it's helpful to know why they're protesting. It doesn't mean you're going to agree with looting and shooting, right? Mm-hmm. Whether it's looting of people on the streets, or whether it's someone saying when the looting starts, the shooting starts. Looting and shooting, they both bad, right? But what is the key reason for the protest, I think, is what's most important. And I think it's okay to have those conversations with a contrarian view when you don't agree with everything, once you have shown humility and empathy and authenticity. But I think if you're going to make a point to say, this is why I disagree with the protest, if you start there, then it's kind of a non-starter, yeah, because where does that go? Does that mean that you really agree with the knee on the neck of the police officer, the knee on the neck of George Floyd from the police officer? No, you probably don't agree with that. But as soon as you start arguing that side, all of those thoughts are flooding in to my mind that you don't care. So when Colin Kaepernick is kneeling for against police brutality peacefully, but now you're mad because people are blowing up stuff in the streets, not peacefully. Well, which one is it? Do you want a peaceful protest for 30 seconds during somebody using their platform? Like, do you think that he really wanted to be more popular or make more money? He was already popular. He already had money. Could he have actually really cared about police brutality? But then what do? We shift and make it an issue about the military and the flag and everything else. It's going to be as peaceful as you can get. He was sitting on a bench, right? And then someone coached him to say, that's disrespectful. Try kneeling. That's more prayerful. So you do that, and look what happens. It's weaponized to continue the ideology of white supremacy. And so which one do we want? Do we want peaceful protest, or do we want protest in the street? And so I think the way you have the conversation is back to a curiosity of, I'm trying to learn, I don't understand, tell me what you think. And you'll be surprised, people will not only tell you, but then they'll ask you what you think about it. And then when you give your opinion, put it like this: I think I'm struggling because I don't understand why people would break into Korean businesses during the protests. I think that's the way you do it.
Yeah, I think that's going to be
Yeah,
really
I think
helpful.
too, yeah. And I think too, this is a question that presents responsibility on the person. As a young person thinking about this, going into school, you're going to be confronted with this stuff. It's not going away. And so you're going to have to stake out where you are. Where are you in your own position? Have these conversations in safe, trusted environments, in small groups, perhaps, in small people that you really know. Have those conversations before you get to those other environments that you're going to have to stand up and really be able to speak. And so, we have a lot of dialogue around the house, but at the same time, talk to some folks and you understand, what do I believe? What do I stand for? And what is right? What is it? And so, like David said, it's one of those things. Yeah, you don't start with non-starters. That's just basic conversational etiquette. But at the same time, you got to be able to, if Stephen Covey said it this way, I must, seek first to understand, then be understood. And sometimes we need to try to understand more so than it's so important that we're understood, because really that's a deal in our own personal measurement of, I want to make sure my voice is heard. Said it doesn't start with humility. So if we start with humility, honoring the other person, deferring to the other person, and then really understand where we come from and what our belief is, then you'll be able to have great conversations if you just understand how to begin to dialogue with people conversationally. And simple thing too is, in order to be a friend, you must first show yourself what? Friendly. So smile, be a friend,
And
be nice.
I'd also add courage. I think this is a time in history where my white brothers and sisters need courage. And what I mean by that is, someone's going to call you a racist. Someone's going to get mad at you. People say, I reach my hand out to black people and they slap it. And this is what I'm going to say to you. It's okay. Have courage to get slapped. I've been called the N-word a lot in my life. I've been pulled over by police. My very first day on the job at Willow Creek Community Church as an intern, I was late because I was stopped 4 times within a 24-hour period by 4 different white police officers, 3 men, 1 woman. I'm David Anderson, Mr. Reconciliation. I just graduated from a white Bible school. And so that's me. That's my story. So the reason I tell you that, and again, how many stories do you want? I can tell you 22 now. But my point is this: it's time for my white brothers and sisters to be courageous enough to say, you know what? If I get called a racist, it's not the worst thing, because he's been called the N-word so many times he can't count. He's been in fights in Adelphi, Maryland. McCoy would tell you, because we knew each other when we were kids. He was in my wedding. We have stories with us together. And so being called a racist is not the worst thing that's going to happen to you, okay? So the only reason I'm saying that is because I now need my white brothers and sisters in the Lord to have courage enough to be offended, to have courage enough to be hurt sometimes because someone doesn't understand them, because this is the skin we've lived in for all of our life, and it's been normal for us. It's probably not so normal to be called a racist, or to have your hand slapped, or to be uncomfortable over and over and over again. And I'm not saying that is what I desire for you at all, but I'm saying don't shrink back from being a reconciler now, because someone is not going to be happy with you.
Yeah.
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 Good.
That's really good.
As we're getting ready to wrap up our discussion, this has just been so. This feels so like Summit, where I feel comfortable and excited and uncomfortable and more. Sometimes I end up with more questions than I started with. But I'd just be really curious for those who are watching right now. How confident do you feel at explaining a biblical worldview of race and justice? And you could say, I'm ready with chapter and verse, or I could explain it at a basic level, or I'd be nervous but would try to stay engaged, or I'd have brain freeze, or I'd feel completely unequipped. Probably I should have asked this question at the beginning and then at the end,
So we could compare.
just so we could kind of compare a little bit. But I'm just going to be really curious to see how that.
Yeah. And while everyone's answering that question, I want to just take a few minutes and give you all both an opportunity to provide us with some concluding thoughts, just a minute or two. Reverend McCoy, I'd like to start with you. What would you like us to take away from this conversation? What should we hold in our minds?
Can I do this? And I'm going to defer to Dr. Anderson because he has a 3:00 radio program. So I'm going to let him speak first.
Okay, perfect.
Oh, you are kind. I love you, my brother. And so good to meet you, Dr. Jeff and Brooke, and all your viewers and listeners at the Summit. I just want to say thanks for having me, and I appreciate you. My final comment would be this. It's not enough not to be a racist. It's not enough to be an anti-racist. We have to be gracist. Gracist is something that you are and something that you do. And if you want to know more about that, go to embracegracism.com and learn how to be a gracist. It gives you something positive to do.
Thank you.
Well, my quick thing would be sticking right to what I said earlier is you got to change your lens. And if you can change your lens and see differently, allow God to work through your life and so you could see a little bit differently, embrace your kingdom birthright and understand that he really wants to do some great things in your life. But I think as well, it's going to take a lot of courage. It's going to take a lot of faith. And it's going to take some endurance, fortitude, and a lot of the principles that he says that we already have. He'll never give you more than we can bear. And I think this is a season we're going to have to bear a little bit and push hard, but we can make a difference together.
Wow,
Amen.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Anderson. Thank you, Reverend McCoy. Really grateful to have you today at Summit Virtual.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank
Good
you.
to be with you.
Okay.
Wow, so a lot happened in that hour and 20 minutes or whatever it's been. But I was looking at the poll here. 10% say I'm ready with chapter and verse. 41% I could explain it at the basic level. 38% I'd be nervous but could stay engaged. Look, I'd have brain freeze or I feel completely unequipped. I'm hoping that those numbers just continue to go down,
Yes.
right? And if you say I'm nervous but I could be engaged, I know how to ask good questions. I'd like to bring this to bear in the discussion. That's really where we want to be. And I think a lot of times at Summit, we see our role as we're going to begin the conversation. This will take the rest of our lives, but we're beginning it now. And if you've enjoyed the time that we have had together, then pass it on. Next week, we're going to send you a link that will have this whole program on it. If you benefited from it and would like to share it with others, we invite you to be able to do that. And we've also put together an ebook on a biblical view of justice. This comes out of understanding the times and understanding the culture, some of the other materials that we've produced that takes some of what we've taught about a biblical view of justice, going all through Scripture, and then applies that to the current racial tensions that we face.
Excellent. We will need
that link that'll be coming to you as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone so much for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Jeff, so much for your time and just your helping us think through this whole situation. It's been really helpful, and we hope that you continue the conversation with your friends and that you take advantage of the resources that we'll bring next week. So we'll see you next time.